think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for those of you who are joining us on our webcast. My name is John Shedlovsky. I'm the director of the International Reporting Project here at New America. We've been here since August, so we're new arrivals at New America and delighted to be here after 18 years here in Washington at Johns Hopkins SAIS previously. Thank you for joining us for today. It's exactly 1 month since the election of the new President of the United States. And as we all know, the future of climate change is now much in the news with the incoming administration. We have a president who has sort of denied the existence of climate change in the past as a Chinese hoax. And we have yesterday's announcement of a new administrator for the EPA who promises to make major changes in that agency. The International Reporting Project, as I said, we've been awarding reporting fellowships for more than 18 years now. We've sent more than 600 journalists to more than 110 different countries around the world to do reporting on important global issues. And many of them have done environmental stories and reports on climate change from around the world. We are delighted that a month ago, as voters were going to the polls here in the United States, a month ago we had 5 journalists in Marrakesh covering the COP22 Global Climate Change Conference. In collaboration with the Stanley Foundation, we selected 5 journalists from around the world to spend 2 weeks at the climate change to see what would come of that meeting, which was a follow-up to the Paris conference a year ago. And we're delighted today to have 2 of those 5 journalists that we supported at that conference to be with us to talk about the impact both of the US election on the future of climate change, which is of course on all of our minds now, but also, before we forget, the results of the Marrakesh conference, which was attended by some 25,000 people from around the world from nearly 200 countries. What exactly happened at that conference? What are the outcomes? What is the future of future international climate change negotiations? Glendora Meikle, who's the deputy director of the International Reporting Project, was also in Marrakesh for 2 weeks, and she's going to moderate the conversation today and introduce our 2 panelists who are distinguished and very experienced journalists on the subject of climate change. So again, with thanks to the Stanley Foundation that collaborated with us on this program, and thanks to you for joining us today, without any further ado, let me turn it over to Glendora for introductions.
All right, well, thanks to both of you for being here. I will introduce you briefly. Zach Coleman is the Deputy Energy and Environment Editor at the Christian Science Monitor based here in Washington. And Susan Phillips is an energy and environment reporter for NPR member station WHYY in Philadelphia. They have both long histories already on reporting on climate change and environment issues. They have both been separately Knight Science Journalism Fellows at MIT, and they have spent those 2 weeks in Marrakesh, as John already mentioned, reporting on the COP22 Climate Change Conference. So we don't want to spend the entire time talking about Trump, of course, or the US administration, because the US role is not the only part of these climate change talks, but I think it is appropriate to start there, just given the context. Day 2 of this 2-week conference was the US elections, and I think it's fair to say, but I would like you both to elaborate, that it probably changed much of the content of that conference. So I'm wondering if you could both talk a little bit about what you intended to cover at COP22, what stories you pitched us, and then what you actually ended up reporting on, if there's a discrepancy there. So Susan, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So, I mean, I went to the COP thinking I'd do a few stories about what happened there, but I knew that it wasn't, you know, I guess the signature large event that Paris was the year before. So the audience back home, you know, they would have needed, I'm a radio reporter, so it's a general audience. they would need to even be reminded, what's going on and what happened in Paris. So I knew it would be pretty simple in terms of what I would do for the actual climate talks. But while there, I also wanted to do features out in the field, but also from the climate talks itself that would relate back to a local regional office, local regional audience in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware area. And coal mining, for instance, is a big issue because southwestern Pennsylvania has a lot of coal miners, and that was a big issue for, as you all I'm sure know, about the election and about the Clean Power Plan, and there had been a lot of layoffs in southwestern Pennsylvania and a lot of struggling coal towns. So I thought, well, I really want to find out from these folks here, what do they have to say to coal miners back home? Because basically they're at this climate change, working to make sure that these coal miners don't have jobs anymore, or at least the jobs that they've had for generations. So that was one idea. And then, I think the other idea was to go to this solar plant, which I ended up not going to. But pretty much, when I got there, I did a setup piece, hey, this is happening, everyone. And then I did a larger feature ahead of Election Day that was just basically, what do Moroccans think about the election? What do they think about Trump? And when I woke up in the middle of the night, somebody had texted me that Trump won, I was like, oh shit, okay, so everything's changed now, and the story's changed now, and basically it all shifted to, here we have, a global diplomatic community here, and what do they think of the Trump election, and what's going to happen with the climate talks that everyone was so optimistic about coming into this conference. So it really shifted a lot.
Yeah, and I just think that the world became very small on November 8th because, like most Americans, I'm one of those dumb people who only speaks English. And I couldn't hear a lot of the conversations or couldn't understand a lot of the conversations that were happening on November 8th, but one thing I could hear a lot was Trump. It was what everyone was talking about. And consequently, it became what we had to report about. Originally, I had gone in with the idea of doing some features on climate smart agriculture, early warning systems for drought and extreme weather events, how you create a more sustainable urban infrastructure to deal with rising sea levels, things of that nature. Still got to do quite a bit of that, but not all of it. But at the same time, you had to start putting out these fires because we didn't really, I don't think this was something that we planned. I think that there were a lot of reporters at the COP who said, if Clinton won, we don't really know what we would have reported on anyway. But now that Trump's won, there's a lot to report on. And it's true, you have to report on fallout. What I ended up focusing on was climate finance as a test for a sort of post maybe US-led climate order, because there were plenty of people at the conference who said, well, we'll be able to push ahead. It's fine. We're going to have to do what we can, but it's fine. The US won't completely recede, and even if they do, others will step up. But this whole disparity between developed and developing countries on who's going to pay for adjusting to a new climate changed world is something that will be tested by the lack of US leadership. If the US pulls out of an aggressive role in climate, then it kind of gives the signal to other countries that might not want to do heavy lifting that they can pull out too. So that became the real story. And there were countries there who were concerned that if the US isn't going to pitch in financially or help leverage more dollars from other countries, that the whole financing element, which has really never been solved in the international climate debate, will also fall apart. So that's the thing to watch going forward. And there's still plenty of reporting on that to be done.
I want to come back in a second to what you were talking about in terms of reporting to local communities, because that's just one other thing I will point out about IRP's fellowships. You two are both American journalists, but you were actually the only American journalist that IRP took. In addition to the two of you, we took a Honduran photojournalist who works primarily in Central and South America, a South African journalist based in London who reports mainly on agriculture and food issues, and a Kenyan journalist who reports largely on the East Africa region for SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation. So we purposely tried to make sure that we do have people who are speaking to different audiences and through different mediums, and the two of you do represent different mediums. You're radio, you're mostly print. So I want to come back to talking how you speak to local audiences in a second, but I want to follow up with you a little bit on policy, because you are based here in Washington and you do frequently speak with US officials. You interviewed outgoing EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy on Monday. I'm wondering if there's anything that that you learned from covering this conference, from looking at things from an international perspective, or maybe specifically when we actually got out of the conference venue and went to speak with some sort of far-flung communities in Morocco who had not actually heard the term climate change, but who had felt the effects. Is there anything that you brought back with you that might help inform the kinds of questions or the way you ask questions to US or international officials in the future?
So I think that this is exactly one of the reasons I wanted to go out to Morocco to begin with. At the Monitor, we just started a new vertical, new semi-autonomous publication called Inhabit that's focusing on the environment, energy, and climate change. And one of our missions is to kind of explain climate science and climate change and the impacts that it's having in a way that is relatable to people in different parts of the country and in different parts of the world. So in the US, obviously, people know that climate change is a subject that people talk about. Whether you believe in it or not, you're aware that is a conversation that's happening. In Morocco, that's not necessarily the case. We went to a mountain village in the High Atlas Mountains where we were talking to people about the changes that they had seen in their community and how it was affecting them in agriculture primarily. But when you ask them, do you know what the term climate change is, they would say no. What is that? And I think that that's important to recognize that you don't really necessarily need to know the word climate change. You might not even need to understand that everything that's happening is climate change. As long as there's an awareness amongst people that something is different and that they need to adapt to it in some way, I think that's the starting point of a conversation with people. And I think it's certainly not what a lot of environmental groups would have you say. They believe very much that people need to understand you need to reduce carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. But we're talking to people here who were using walnuts as their currency. I mean, this is not something where they are contributing a massive amount of emissions themselves. But they need to figure out, how do we live in this world that's changing? We were talking to people who noticed that the snow melt was much decreased in the Atlas Mountains. Around the time we were there, it's usually snowy on the Atlas Mountains. There was hardly any snow, maybe a light dusting. They said the water doesn't come through this river anymore when we need it to come through. So they're aware of this, and they're adapting to it. And I think that as long as you can meet people where they are on some of these issues and start to have a conversation about what they're seeing, that's kind of where you can begin to have a more robust climate conversation, rather than coming at them and saying, you know, climate change is happening. How do you not know that's not climate change? Ask them what they're seeing and you know, start where they're at.
Yeah. I think you both will probably have something to say about this question, but coming back to talking to local audiences, I think that one narrative that sort of emerged from the conference was that even though so many of the topics that we were talking about were very high level and you know, speaking international agreements that were being spoken of, you have to find a way to make that relevant to your listeners at home. And I think that's especially part of the goal of your job, because you work for NPR, but you also work locally for WHYY. And so many people just want to know, how does this affect me, or what might have been talked about at an international climate conference that I could possibly care about here in Philadelphia. How do you do that? What's the way to get people interested at a local level?
So, I mean, I think the main thing is how is it going to impact them, right? I mean, and again, it's what every good journalist knows how to do, pretty much find a good character that can illustrate the impact. And one of the stories I end up doing while I was there was a local sort of contingent of academics and students who had come to the COP from the Philadelphia area, from universities around the Philadelphia area, and I just sat down with them one day and talked to them about their experiences and what were they thinking before they came, and then how the Trump, election impacted them and what they saw, and what are they taking away from this international conference. And I think using people who the radio listener would relate to, because maybe they know they have a son or daughter that goes to Drexel or Lehigh. I mean, there's always some kind of connection if you can get a local person who had a stake in the conference and explain what their work is. And also just through that story, through the voices of the local people, you can touch on the issues that actually were that were actually being discussed at the conference. And one of them was, the fact that cities and states now, everyone's sort of looking to them to keep the fire going for the next 4 years. Not that it could match what the U.S. federal government could do in terms of reducing emissions, but what I found, and I think Zach would agree, is it was really hard to find anybody at the COP, whether it was somebody from an NGO, the State Department, diplomats, anyone, activists, who would admit that somehow the election was gonna just kill the Paris Agreement. I mean, it was almost like an existential crisis for them. They could not, admit that. So any kind of thread of positive silver lining they could hold on to, they grabbed and held on to like a life raft. And one of those was the fact that, well, we've got California, and California's here, they've got a delegation, and they're committed to reducing emissions. And then we have all these blue cities all over the place, and they're, dedicated to reducing emissions. And so, maybe we can keep this thing together through that.
Yeah, that did seem to be a point of optimism against all the uncertainty, is that it did seem as if, okay, yes, a lot has been agreed at an international level, but now much of it will be in the hands of local leaders and communities. Did you have anything that you wanted to kind of add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of talk of some of these bluer states and cities leading the way, but I mean, sure, you have California, but California has so much renewable energy that they aren't even going to be able to use it all on their grid, and they're trying to export it to other states that don't want it. So, there's only so much that you can do if you're California or if you're, Massachusetts. At some point, from the U.S. perspective, you're going to need someone like Wyoming or Nevada or, any number of southeast states to also realize this is in their best interest, because the coastal states can't do it all themselves. There's a point of diminishing marginal returns, and you can't expect all of them to do all the work for the states that aren't going to do anything. The silver lining stuff, yeah, that was definitely present. I think that there is still a lot the cities will be able to do, a lot that corporations can still do, but it's kind of crazy how the Obama administration started sounding like a Cato board meeting over the course of the election. I mean, it was all free markets, states, cities. And, I think that markets are trending in that direction, sure. But at the same time, Gina McCarthy has said you need the Clean Power Plan to lock in all the progress and the forward momentum on renewables. Well, if the markets were really doing it all, you don't need anything to lock it in. So there is this recognition that, yeah, you still need to push forward quite aggressively, and that leaving states and cities up to their own devices without any sort of policy push might not get you there.
Well, I think it's clear that journalism is going to be playing a continually important role in getting these issues discussed, and I'm wondering if there are topics that you noticed at the conference were probably undercovered because everything was so suddenly devoted to the election. I know certainly financing is something you talked about and we're able to cover a bit, but that's a huge thing. Financing these adaptation and mitigation strategies that have been spoken of, impacts on indigenous populations, climate refugees, which is still not a term that's actually recognized by the UN. Were there particular conversations you had with groups who were, lamenting the fact that their particular issue was not going where they had hoped it would during this conference because it was overshadowed by the American elections?
Well, I feel like every group felt that way. I mean, I think we felt that way. I mean, we had stories we wanted to do and we couldn't do them because everyone wanted to talk about the election. I think that there was a good amount of frustration that the refugee issue didn't get a little bit more airing, but it's a kind of politically tricky time to do that. You go talk about opening up the Human Rights Convention and refugees, and then you have a whole number of countries who are going to want to play with the language to keep refugees out of their own countries for any number of reasons right now. So that's one of the reasons you can't go to that, those protections for a climate perspective, because you might end up in a backdoor way eliminating protections for refugees that already exist. So there's a lot of overlapping kind of problems with that. But the financial one has long dogged this whole process, and that will continue to be the case next time around too. And we'll have to see. I think a lot depends on what the U.S. is able to put forward too. I mean, you're talking about getting $100 billion by 2020 in overall climate aid. Trump will still be president around then. I don't know if it'll always be a Republican Congress through those 4 years, but it will be for the next 2. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, did you have anything any stories you think probably should have been covered but just didn't? Any groups, anyone you spoke to, any conversations you had where people were especially frustrated?
I mean, the climate conference itself was so overwhelming. It was almost like a 3-ring circus of human misery via climate change. I mean, every day there was so many little meetings or seminars or events about this particular aspect of climate change or that particular aspect of climate change and who's suffering, I think that when we're talking about finance, the big issue is with these least developed countries, right? Because they need money to adapt and mitigate, and that was sort of a linchpin of the Paris Agreement. If the rich countries were able to give financing to the poorest countries, then the poorest countries were able to sign on and reduce their emissions and whatnot. And I know Zach and I sat down with one gentleman from the Democratic Republic of Congo, whose job it was to advocate for these least developed nations. And this was after the Trump election, and he was very diplomatic. I mean, that was kind of amazing to me. I never covered any diplomatic events before, but it's kind of impressed me at how good diplomats are at being diplomatic. But he did talk about the struggles of his country and, other countries and what would happen. And I asked him, look, what keeps you up at night? And he said, my daughter, because there's more malaria, there's more mosquitoes because of the increase in, I guess, the more hot days and more breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and mosquitoes are being found at higher latitudes or higher elevations. And so my daughter is getting malaria more. And so she's crying a lot and she's getting sick, and that's what we're dealing with. And so I think those kind of stories were probably everywhere at the COP. But yeah, it's just a matter of like what you're going to prioritize, and again, how to bring it back to a local audience or a national audience. That's what you're doing.
Well, I think you briefly mentioned the language of journalism, which I think is going to be maybe even more closely examined than usual. I mean, John, you mentioned, last night when we got the announcement that Trump had picked the new EPA administrator, it was an interesting little sort of side event in the journalism community to see that the New York Times had originally headlined their article on that announcement. They had called him a climate change dissenter, and there was such an outcry over that terminology that within an hour they had revised the headline to call him a climate change denier. And I wonder, any sort of, I don't know, any extra scrutiny towards linguistics or anything that you anticipate might be sort of added to the uphill battle that sometimes climate and environment journalists already have to face when we are looking at an administration that may be giving credence to more climate change deniers?
I mean, AP changed it to doubter like a year or so ago. I really don't know who uses that. Not that I do the headlines, but we went with climate change skeptic to describe Scott Pruitt. I think that there's a lot of, actually when you look at some things, there is some nuance in what it means to be a skeptic. I mean, you can totally agree that climate change is happening and that temperatures are rising, and that means sea level will rise, but have a complete disagreement on how much the planet is going to warm based on certain models. I understand that the models aren't perfect and there's variance in all of that, and in some respects that's good skepticism, but it's not gonna, I don't know, I struggle with it because I think that it is, in some ways, a complicated issue. Science is not easy behind it, and there's a lot of true but irrelevant facts that people can, depending on their news source, if they're credible, will focus on, and that can mislead people. Doesn't mean that the facts about the science are untrue, it's just in the broader sense of the literature, it's not as relevant. So it's a confusing field, and there needs to be more clarity about it. I don't think it's necessarily right to demonize people who aren't public servants, but if you're a public servant, you're deemed to be pretty smart, I would hope. You're trusted with a lot, and you want them to be well informed. I'm not asking half the internet commenters in the world to run the EPA, but I hope the person who's running the EPA is well informed about the science behind the stuff he's regulating. So I think that's the task here, is for journalists, when the science is being misinterpreted or used improperly to support a certain action or aim, then journalists have to come in and explain what the science is and how it's being convoluted.
Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there are those who understand the science of climate change very well, but that doesn't help their bottom line, and so they will manipulate the facts and manipulate people who aren't as well informed as them, and I think it definitely is the job of journalists to hold them accountable, for sure. But again, I definitely see, that sort of two different camps, in the people who genuinely don't believe in climate change for whatever reason, and those who are smart enough and are educated enough to believe in it, but yet, willfully manipulate the facts for their own bottom line, and
Yeah, it's an interesting and important distinction. I'm aware of time, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. So I will just ask one more sort of broad questions before I open it up to the audience. this COP, COP22, was billed as the action COP after Paris last year, where all of the discussions and high-level agreements happened. Do you think there was an overall outcome to this year's conference?
To come back and try again. Going into the conference, everybody kind of understood that this was going to be a nuts and bolts kind of thing. We'll never know what more might have been accomplished had the U.S. election not turned out the way it did. I think that definitely set people back a little bit. But from the beginning of the conference, people said the end goal here is to just get to 2018 and set that as a deadline for basically the actual framework that's going to underpin all the accounting for these emissions reductions and the review process and holding people accountable. So I think that's exactly what happened.
Any ideas on an overall outcome, or was there one?
I mean, I agree with what Zach just said, and I think that coming into the conference, there were a lot of people hopeful that, okay, the latest science says that our goals from Paris weren't really good enough. We need to go further, and the least developed countries were, thinking we're going to have to get more money out of these people. But that didn't really seem to happen. Like Zach said, it was like, okay, let's just keep this thing going,
Yeah. Well, I will say, I think there was the one thing I noticed that I had never thought of until actually it was pointed out by a woman who moderated a panel you were on in Morocco. It's already been announced that next year's conference will be held in Bonn, but sort of hosted by Fiji. And it's almost a shame that it won't be held in Fiji because of a consequence that I had never thought of. And the woman who moderated your panel said that before this conference came to Morocco, most Moroccans didn't know much about climate change, didn't know about recycling, and that one side effect of hosting a conference, which receives its fair share of criticism, spending all this money, bringing all these people together every year. One side effect is that now Moroccans know about climate change. They know about simple measures like recycling that they didn't 6 months ago before this conference had become such a big deal for a country like Morocco. So I think there is that tiny silver lining there, as well as we're all looking to grab onto some silver linings. But I definitely want to hear from the audience to see what kind of, all right, let's start over here, Riker or Joanne.
Hi, thank you very much for holding this, and thank you for reporting on what you saw. Yes, I'm Dr. Mindy Reiser. I'm a sociologist, and I've worked internationally, and one of my questions deals with that. But before the question, an observation. I think you talked about cities and states being innovative and entrepreneurial, but the world of the foundations will have to take up some of this. And perhaps they will band together and allocate some really creative funding for innovative projects. My question is this. I've worked in the post-Soviet Union, the republics. So I'm wondering what Russia had to say. I realize that it was not a 3-ring circus, a 5-ring circus, and you couldn't be everywhere. But I wonder if you had a chance to hear or see any journalists from Russia, any interventions, and I'm also curious about China, what they said, and any colleagues who were working in the Chinese press, if you had any encounters with them either.
I mean, I didn't talk to anyone from Russia, unfortunately. China, though, they were very much willing to take their leadership role. I mean, that they're kind of the de facto leaders, and I think that they're relishing the opportunity to have the kind of soft power as climate leaders that, up until recently, they never could have imagined having. For years, they were kind of viewed as the climate laggard and an obstacle in international negotiations. At least that's how it was held up from the U.S. perspective, and that prevented the U.S. from doing anything majorly aggressive on climate internationally for a while. But now they're going full bore, China is, and I don't anticipate that changing. It's a domestic concern for them as well with the air pollution they have. So, that's something that I don't see them pulling back on. But, I'm not a China reporter. I don't profess to know the Politburo very well, so I'm going to have to stop there on that.
Yeah, similarly, it's an interesting question because there was a lot about talk about China, and we heard about China, and their commitment despite Trump. Same with India, but I don't remember hearing much about Russia or any events with Russia, and I don't remember actually ever seeing any Russian journalists. Although that doesn't mean they weren't there.
Oh, Larry King wasn't there? No, I'm just Russia Today joke, everybody.
So yeah, no, it's there was this huge big tent-like structure with all the journalists in the same place, but I don't remember seeing anyone from
No,
Russia.
yeah, it's a good point and a good observation. I also don't recall, and there were areas in this massive structure that was the conference where each country did have a setup if they wanted it, and I don't recall seeing one from Russia.
But to the sociologists here, reporting is not empiricism, so
Exactly,
there
yes.
were probably some.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure they
Russians
were there.
And
I
there
just
were
didn't run into that.
1,200 accredited journalists
Yeah.
at this thing, so yeah, we might have missed a few of them.
There were Indians.
Yeah, they were there.
For sure.
They were there.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
And India, obviously was an active participant in
Right.
the talks.
Hi, Emily Gallagher, New America Resource Security. I had a question because in Paris, one of the big successes was that there was not just public leaders, but there was also private sector leaders, and really led the way in some really innovative things I've never done at COPs before. Was there any of this, any kind of organizations from anywhere in the world available at COP22?
Private sector? You mean the businesses? Oh yeah, definitely. And they came out with a couple statements saying, we're forging ahead, momentum is strong. I mean,
Yeah, they were very out front and center. Mars Corporation was kind of one of the bigger. They were on like pretty much every panel, it seemed. So yeah, I think that there's definitely a commitment from the private sector. You look at big companies now. I think there's a Bloomberg story that came out around the COP that 60% of Fortune 100 companies have a climate or clean energy plan. So that's impressive. I mean, compared to where we were a few years ago, there's definitely companies taking this seriously. I think it's for them. It looks good, and I think there's just going to have to be mind paid to whether this is another round of greenwashing. I mean, this happened in the run-up to cap and trade, too, where there were a lot of announcements made, and it's tough to figure out whether these companies are following through because they're private. So that's the thing. You can talk a big game, but you've got to follow through, too. So we'll see what happens.
And I think that's one of the difficulties in trying to report from something that is so massive and chaotic as a conference is that oftentimes it's difficult to know what's all these events that are happening simultaneously, and by default sometimes you're most aware of organizations or groups that have the best PR because they're the ones sending out the most press releases, and our inboxes are just chock full every day of things that are going on, everyone trying to get your attention. So that's one of the challenges and reasons we don't cover conferences very easily, because it's difficult to sort through it and figure out what are the most relevant things.
You would have no idea how crazy it is to cover this conference. I mean, there in the side event room alone are 8 events going on at once. And then if you really want information about what's actually happening at the conference, you're wasting your time being in the side events. You've got to go out into the main hall or figure out where these people are taking a cigarette break, or just where they go to the bathroom. And you've got to know what they look like. And you've got to be able to grab them and possibly even speak their language. So it's not necessarily the easiest thing to cover in the world.
at the same time, at the end of the day, it's the same story, right?
Right.
I mean, there are these, you can get caught up in the conference swirl, like these little rumors that are going around and these little nuances, but at the end of the day, it's like, well, they did what they did, so.
And they'll only put so much on the record.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Andrew Tabor from the Mountain Institute, and I wanted to sort of raise sort of a conundrum, which I'd be very interested in your perspectives on. My sympathies for journalists at the COP. I mean, I was there, and we have a fairly active presence. You know, so many different things going on that it's really hard to know where to even begin. And you know, it's almost like every journalist that one talks to has a different COP, went to almost a different meeting because there's so many different threads. So really, my question is about how does one raise the profile of important issues that just get lost in all of this big mess. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We work on mountain issues. One of the critical things is water supplies. About half the world's water comes from mountains. Pakistan wouldn't exist as a country without the Upper Indus. It's interesting that both Morocco and Peru, where the last COP and then the one before Paris were, those are countries utterly dependent on mountain water sources. Those water sources are being utterly hammered by all sorts of changes. You call it climate change, call it what you want, but there's serious challenges. Morocco, if you look at the government projections and so on, population change plus changes in snowfall and so on, frankly, 50 years out, is that a country that has a future? I fear not. So, you know, there are so many different issues. How do you choose, and how can one raise the issue? I mean, I can throw out some other mountain examples. About 40% of the world's food insecure live in mountains. There's new data on this. There's tremendous problems with starvation, about 340 million people. Small island states grab a huge amount of attention. Small island states have about 50 million people in them. All told, we've probably got 50 million children in mountain regions that are malnourished and their brains aren't developing properly and so on. So I could go on and on.
Yeah,
My
so
particular pet issue.
What's
So
the
what do
way
you
for an
do?
organization to grab the attention of a journalist? Is that what you're
That's the
interested
question.
in? Yeah.
How do you raise the profile of important issues in such a sea of issues that need more attention?
Well, I think you just kind of have to know the outlet that you're trying to get the attention of. I mean, so a lot of my colleagues will end up reporting on every turn of the screw at the COP, and they might not have the time to focus on something like that unless it fits into something that is being discussed at the machinery of the COP. So for me, you know, I'm reaching a more national audience that doesn't care so much about the ins and outs of what's actually happening in the plenary. So, you know, you reach out to that organization ahead of time and say, hey, like, this is something that's happening. And I know it's a lot of legwork and to figure out who that's going to resonate with, but our inboxes just get filled during this conference with so much material that you can't even keep, you know, you can't keep track of it all. But if you get a real personalized pitch, you know, and it might fit in with something that you had planned to cover, because every reporter comes to this conference with an idea of what they want to do if they can stay on track, which is what I learned very difficult to do. So if you fit in that window ahead of the conference, like that's the way to do it. I don't think there's enough booths that you can put up or flyers you can pass out that will get you interested. It needs to really be a tailored, personalized message to someone to get someone's attention.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, but also that's the kind of story you don't do from a conference. You know, you do that, you may have the conference as the news peg. So, for instance, you know, the best thing to do would be find a reporter that's done that kind or similar reporting, or, you know, and pitch them the story, because they really have to go to these places to do the story. They need to talk to these people who are impacted, and they're not going to be at the conference. So, or, you know, use the conference to develop a relationship with a reporter that you think would travel to those areas and actually do those stories sometime later. You know, that's what I would do.
I think there were a lot of reporters, though, who were at the conference. I mean, we were lucky because we got to go with IRP that helped facilitate some of these side trips. But there are a lot of reporters who went out on their own and did features who weren't just always at the COP, because there were plenty of feature stories from Morocco during that time. So I know that those reporters who did those were probably also covering the conference itself. So if you can get in weeks ahead of time, you know when a reporter, if you know if a reporter is going, and you get in weeks ahead of time, maybe you can get them to change their plans. And that's I mean, because if I had known about the Mountain Institute, we definitely would have connected because I was doing a lot of reporting on that. So we'll connect afterwards. So.
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jed Schilling. I'm actually on the board of the Mountain Institute and involved with the Millennium Institute, which does system dynamic modeling of sustainable development issues. And one thing about climate change, I'm interested in your reaction to what was going on at this conference, is it's a global issue and we have global responsibility to deal with it. But the actions really need to be taken at local, state, national, regional levels. So what evidence did you see that countries were willing to be involved in more cross-country cooperation in dealing with these issues and recognizing that this could be an important part of their foreign policy issues?
Well, there's an event that World Resources Institute helped put together, the High Ambition Coalition, where it's countries that are trying to outshoot their INDCs, basically. And they're going to create a clearinghouse of information and best practices to share across countries. I mean, it's that kind of collaboration that can help, and there's a lot of regional collaboration in Africa as well to promote renewables. There's the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, which has very ambitious targets and a lot of coordination at the inter-regional level. So that kind of stuff is happening. There's some carbon markets that are even starting to form when you talk about California, Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia working together. And theoretically, if you design a good carbon market, you can have cities just join in whether their state wants to or not. I think that'd be hard to administer, but you can do that. So those kinds of conversations are happening, and that's a meeting place for all those people who have like-minded ideas to work on that. And I would imagine in a lot of these workshops where people are working on the rules for accountability and transparency and carbon markets, those conversations are happening as well. We're not allowed to be in those rooms, but this is where you get people to convene once a year, and then they go home to their countries and they stay in contact, and hopefully they keep working on these things.
I mean, I would just add that the point you made that it's local, it's not the federal level diplomatic corps that actually puts all this into place. You're right. It's local communities, it's cities, it's states, and I've reported a lot about that in the past and how there's this disconnect between the local communities and what happens at these conferences. And I think at this conference there was actually for the first time much more of a presence of local communities. I think in Paris as well. I mean, there were some major events about cities from all over the world and how they could, collaborate and communicate and share ideas about what to do regarding both adaptation and mitigation. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're going to see probably more and more of that as more impacts of climate change start hitting local communities.
And this is not the only conference where they work on these issues. Right after this was the C40 conference in Mexico City, where there were a lot of collaborative announcements on GHG emission reduction measurements and things of that nature. So there's a lot of this stuff happening. It might not have all happened at the COP, but there's plenty of these conferences.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jack Kropansky, unaffiliated. Was there much discussion among the COP officials about communication strategy and the general public, or is this all an inside baseball kind of thing where it's just how people with inside government agencies talk to each other? But my real question actually is getting to, do you know where the poll trends are these days with the general public? Because if the general public doesn't really support something, then the politicians aren't going to really support it. So.
Question.
Yeah, it's a good question. My impression was that most of it was, there was a lot of inside baseball, as you would imagine, because these are high-level talks, plus the people there are very specialized in what they know. like oceans, the impact of, ocean acidification or, away seas. They're very, very specialized in their kind of meeting with each other. In terms of communicating to the broader public about climate change, I'm sure there were events. I don't remember what they were. I don't know, maybe you
I
had
don't recall any, but the whole conference is an echo chamber.
Yeah.
I mean, if you are there, you work on these issues. It's not like you're going to fund your own trip to Marrakesh and go into the COP just for fun. I mean, you might, I don't know, but that wasn't my idea of fun. So, yeah, it's people are already on board there. So I don't know if there's much thought paid to communicating it to the outside public.
I think that's what you were there to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think that's why they
I think
accredited
1,200
1,200 journalists to
Right.
go
Yeah.
and cover this, because, yeah, I think we certainly came across many people. I mean, I had many conversations where people would say, oh, yeah, this is my 15th COP, or we have
Yeah.
been every year. And they know how to
Yeah.
navigate it, I think, much better than some of us did, because it is just so sprawling and so overwhelming. Other questions? All right, yeah, I think, okay, we can go back to one more.
I just thought of this. In a lot of these major conferences, there's often a youth delegation or there's a separate meeting of younger people, however you describe this. Was that in evidence at this conference? Were there fora for young people to talk about how they see these problems and actions they would like young people to take?
Yeah, shout out to Justine over there. I helped moderate a panel for the UN Foundation for youths who are working on climate change issues. They were very present. There are youth delegates from a number of countries who go there. And I think that was one of the stories that probably could have been told a little bit more, to be quite honest, is when we talk about stories that were overshadowed, is the commitment that younger generations have to climate change. And you look at polls there, I mean, polls amongst younger people on doing something on climate change are overwhelmingly, yes, it's real, something needs to be done. So I think that was a very strong presence there.
Yeah, and students were there. Like, I interviewed some of them for a local story about local people who were there, for sure. Yeah, I mean, there were definitely a number of events focused on youth.
And I'd say that's a good point in recognizing that there is much more agreement among youth that things need to be done. And interestingly, the U.S. envoy, special envoy for climate change, spoke at an event at CSAS just up the road yesterday. And one thing he noted, we think of climate change oddly now as a partisan issue, but he pointed out that the first UNFCCC negotiations happened here in Washington in 1991 under Bush 41 years. So it didn't always, it wasn't always so divisive. And maybe with the next generation, we'll be heading into a little more unity with how we think of this issue. All right, yeah, let's do one more and then maybe we'll try to wrap.
For what it's worth, on the polling, that it holds up that there's a strong generational difference in the numbers that cuts across parties. So the polling does support that. But so I'm Sharon Burke, and I'm here at New America. I know you touched on the election a little bit, but I mean, it must have been an extraordinary part of the story that you weren't necessarily expecting to report watching the American delegation deal with the news. Were you able to get them to talk to you about it, and how fast, how did their story change? Because I mean, I've heard Pershing talk about it, and I mean, he's still having trouble. He's by nature, I think, a very upbeat guy, so he probably found his voice pretty quickly. But that must have been a really interesting element of the story. And were you able to cover it? Were you able to get the Americans to talk to you about it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting part of the story, like you said. So the first time there was any, that the press had any access to somebody from the American delegation was, I think, a couple days later. Maybe it was Saturday. There was a number of us there, and it was one of these, events about oceans. And this poor woman, I mean, she was an undersecretary, and you know, she came and sat there, and there's like an entire, you know, there must have been about 10 different international reporters, you know, China, Japan, Germany, you know, me, you know, all over the place. And, you know, she sat down and gave this talk about oceans that nobody cared about. And, you know, there was a surprising question from the German guy, or maybe he was from AFP. I can't remember where he was from. But anyway, he surprisingly asked about ocean. I asked him later, like, why did you ask about oceans? And he was just like, I don't know. I felt bad for her. Because once she answered his question, it was like, boom, 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 boom. You know, what's going to happen with Trump? You know, what's going to happen with Trump? What's going to happen with Trump? And, you know, she tried to stay as unfrazzled as possible. But at one point, she said something really interesting because, you know, she was getting bombarded. And she said, you know, we have one president at a time. And then I pushed her a little further, and she was just like, I don't know, you know. But after that, you know, Pershing was on message, John Kerry came, and he was on message.
At length.
And of course, like, the journalists were like, oh, rolling their eyes. But like everybody else was like, wasn't that great? You know, and so that's where I saw this like existential crisis happening with everybody. I mean, it was just like, did everyone drink this Kool-Aid? Because everybody is on message, and you couldn't get anyone off it, you know. So, yeah, that was really interesting. The lame duckness of the U.S. delegation. Yeah. It was kind of surreal, to be honest with you.
Well.
Of course it had to be.
It was definitely not what they expected.
No.
No. Well, and conversely, didn't you have the microphone turned back on you? The next day after the election, you were asking a question as a reporter, and someone said, wait, we have an American in the room, we need to ask you questions. What just happened? I mean, didn't you have that happen to you just the very next day?
Yeah, that was a weird event.
But it was also just strange to be there as an American and have to, you were approached.
I had a Saudi Arabian businessman pull the who has a better democratic institution card on me. So I don't know. I didn't feel it was a very fair question. So
Right.
I said, I'm the one asking questions. That was it.
All right. All right. We will do. Yeah. We have time for one more.
Yeah, Judge Hilling again. A couple of things. One, I was in Morocco a couple of weeks before this, and they're putting in a lot of renewables in Morocco because they've got so much sunshine and wind. But my question is, was there any clarity in the discussions of the actions that need to be taken of what the priorities were for what needed to be done in developed or developing countries to get the most attention in the short to medium run?
Technologies in the short to medium run. You know, I think it's the same stuff that you hear all the time. You know, solar and wind, battery storage would be nice. Didn't hear a ton about nuclear. There was one geoengineering panel that I was aware of, and you know, there wasn't a ton on carbon capture and storage, from what I recall. It was pretty boilerplate, environmental group oriented, like traditional environmental group oriented solutions. So I think that was, you know, clean vehicles, things of that nature.
And not on agricultural issues?
Oh, a lot of agricultural issues. That was probably one of the bigger topics. I mean, it was termed.
There was a whole day that was, the days were themed, and agriculture was one of the days.
It was termed the COP of action. They wanted to show people doing action, and I think that Morocco, there was actually a lot of really cool agricultural work happening to adapt to climate change. I mean, planting like prickly pears and argan trees for carbon sequestration, which is pretty smart. So yeah, there was definitely a lot on that. I would say probably half the booths in the side exhibit room were devoted to agriculture.
Right, and it's my understanding, you covered more of the agriculture than I did, but it's my understanding that the least developed countries, though the poorer countries, were not very happy with the end results in terms of what was decided about helping them adapt their agriculture. And the funds, I guess they obviously wanted more funds and more commitment towards helping them adapt with droughts and whatnot. And they sort of went away from the COP very unhappy with what was decided.
But that's often the case at the COP. I mean, the least developed countries, until there's a strong commitment to financing some of these projects, they will leave unhappy. And, I don't think anyone really blames them. It's just a hard thing to square. They aren't responsible for the emissions largely that have caused the problem, but the trend showed they will be producing more of the emissions in the future. So, it's just a tough issue.
Yeah. Did you have one more? Yeah, I think we'll do one more, and then we invite you all to join us for some coffee and refreshments in the back.
Yes, this is just is this on? Yeah. Just like a follow-up question regarding the agricultural incentives. So, was there much talk about the development or incentivizing growing more perennial staple crops, and some of the trials that are being done, the field trials on perennial rice, for example, and some of these other crops that could really help to reduce tillage and some of the carbon footprint of this industrialized agricultural system that has, caused so much trouble?
Yeah, I mean, we went to a prickly pear farm. That's not something that you have to keep replanting. It's growing in a drought-hit area, and it's a drought-tolerant plant.
These are the cactus flowers, for anyone not familiar. It's cactuses just grow these fruits. You have to do almost nothing to them. They were saying, we asked, how do you get these to grow? And they said, if a petal falls off, it'll sort of root and regrow itself. So in very, very dry climate.
Yeah, and we didn't spend a ton of time out, in the field, unfortunately, so we didn't get to see a whole lot in action. And frankly, I wasn't able to sit in on too many panels on agriculture, but there were a lot of panels. I mean, there's no doubt that it was a huge discussion topic. What exactly was discussed in each one, I'm not sure. But.
Nothing to add on that? Okay.
No,
Yeah.
I wasn't in the weeds like that on agriculture, so I don't.
No pun intended.
No pun.
All right. Well, I think a pun is an excellent place to end. We just want to thank you all for coming. This is the first event that IRP has done since our move to New America. We hope to do many more starting in 2017. Really want to thank Zach Coleman and Susan Phillips for making themselves available to chat with us today. And of course, thank the Stanley Foundation, who was our collaborator in this endeavor in sending our fellows to Marrakesh. So thank you all so much for coming. Please stick around and enjoy some coffee and refreshments in the back.